Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The air in Jackson Township, Ohio, had a bitter, metallic taste on the night of January 9th, 2017. It was the kind of cold that seeped through the thickest coats and settled deep in the bones. A cold that made the world outside seem hostile and unforgiving. Snow had been falling intermittently, a fine, wind-driven powder that dusted the skeletal trees and clung to the asphalt of the strip mall parking lot on Portage Street. Inside Ang's Asian cuisine, the clatter of the dinner rush had subsided, replaced by the quieter sounds of cleaning and closing. The scent of soy sauce and fried ginger still hung in the air, a ghost of the evening's business. It was in this deceptive calm, just after 9:30 p.m., that a thread was pulled, and the carefully constructed fabric of a family's life began to unravel into a nightmare. The voice on the other end of the 911 call was male, tight with a nervousness that frayed the edges of his words. "Jackson Township Police," the dispatcher answered, her tone practiced and calm. "Yes, I need some help," the man stuttered. "Okay, where are you at?" 4924 Portage Street, he replied, giving the address of the restaurant. I can't find my daughter." The man identified himself as Liang Zhao, the co-owner of Ang's Asian cuisine. His daughter, he explained, was Ashley. She had just turned 5. The last time he'd seen her was that afternoon, maybe around 4 o'clock or 5 p.m. In the background, a woman's voice, thin and sharp, could be heard correcting him, shouting out times. The dispatcher, patient but firm, tried to pin down the timeline. 5 hours? A 5-year-old had been missing for 5 hours? Liang's story tumbled out in a disjointed rush. Ashley had been tired, he said. She had fallen asleep in a back room of the restaurant while the family worked. He had left to pick up their older daughter, Jojo, from school. He, his wife, and Jojo had all seen Ashley sleeping there when he returned. Then the dinner service got busy. It was a blur of taking orders, cooking, and serving. When the rush finally died down, and they began to clean up, they went to check on Ashley. The room was empty. She was gone. "Do you think she could have woken up and ran out somewhere?" the dispatcher asked, her voice a steady anchor in Liang's rising panic. "I have no idea," he said. "She was sleeping in the back." There were no other employees, he confirmed. Just him and his wife, Ming Chen. No security cameras. They'd been in business for 6 years and had never needed them. He insisted there had been no suspicious customers, nothing out of the ordinary. The story was simple, terrifying, and plausible. A little girl, waking up disoriented in the back of a busy restaurant, had wandered out the back door and into the treacherous, freezing Ohio night. Less than 3 minutes into the call, the dispatcher's voice cut through Liang's frantic explanations. "All right, my officer's outside if you want to go and meet my officer at the door." "He's here right now?" Liang asked, a new note of alarm in his voice, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to hold more than just surprise. "Yeah, he's already outside." The line went quiet. Outside, the flashing lights of a Jackson Township police cruiser painted the falling snow in strobing blues and reds, the first signal that the ordinary rhythm of this suburban town was about to be irrevocably broken. The search for Ashley Zhao had begun. The initial response was swift and methodical. A 5-year-old girl, dressed only in a purple winter coat and gray leggings, was lost in the freezing dark. The stakes were absolute. The first officer on the scene, met by a distraught Liang Zhao, began a preliminary search of the immediate area. The back door of the restaurant opened onto a small service alley, and beyond that, a patch of dense, wooded terrain with thick brush and pockets of water. A treacherous landscape for a small child, especially in a blizzard with near-zero visibility. Word spread like a crack in ice. Soon, the single police cruiser was joined by others. The Jackson Township Fire Department arrived, deploying thermal imaging cameras and drones to scan the frozen woods from above, their humming blades cutting through the silent snowfall. The Ohio Attorney General's office issued a statewide missing child alert, and Ashley's smiling face, a picture of innocence, began to flash across television screens and social media feeds. The community, shaken from its winter slumber, responded with a wave of heartfelt concern. Strangers, bundled against the biting wind, began to gather near the restaurant, their faces etched with worry. Douglas Panarella, who worked across the street and was a regular at Ang's, vowed to conduct his own search when he left work, a sentiment echoed by dozens of others who felt the primal, parental fear of a lost child. As the hours stretched on, the search intensified. The FBI and the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, were called in to assist, bringing with them a higher level of expertise and resources. The search radiated outward from the restaurant, a grim, ever-widening circle of hope and dread. Investigators on foot, their breath pluming in the frigid air, combed through the woods, their flashlight beams cutting futile patterns in the dark. K-9 units sniffed through the snow-dusted undergrowth, their handlers calling Ashley's name into the unanswering quiet. Yet, as the massive external search unfolded under the glare of news cameras, a second, quieter investigation was taking place inside the restaurant itself. Investigators, trained to see the unseen, began to notice small but unsettling details. Liang Zhao and Mingming Chun, while appearing distressed, seemed oddly passive. They opted not to make a personal plea to the media, a common and often effective tool in missing child cases. Their narrative, while consistent, had a rehearsed quality, like a script they had both memorized. The most glaring anomaly, however, was the complete absence of witnesses. In a busy strip mall on a Monday evening, no one, not a single person, had seen a small girl in a purple coat wander out of the restaurant. The possibility that Ashley had never left the building began to take root in the investigators' minds. They started to treat the restaurant not just as the starting point of the search, but as a potential crime scene. They began a second, more meticulous search of the premises. They looked in every cupboard, every closet, every walk-in cooler. They checked inside appliances, behind stacks of supplies, in any space a small, lost child might crawl into. The atmosphere inside Ang's Asian cuisine grew thick with unspoken suspicion, a stark contrast to the desperate hope that still flickered outside. The search party braved the elements through the night and into the next day, Tuesday, January 10th. The community held vigils, leaving stuffed animals, flowers, and cards in a growing, makeshift memorial outside the restaurant's front door. But inside, the focus had narrowed. Investigators were re-examining the kitchen, a space of stainless steel and organized chaos. Above the large, walk-in freezer, they noticed a small crawl space. It was dark and seemingly empty, a space easily overlooked. It was large enough for a child to squeeze into. An investigator boosted himself up. He peered into the darkness. There, pushed into the recess, was a large plastic container. As he pulled it closer, he saw it was filled with a white, crystalline substance that looked like salt. And then he saw it. Poking out from the salt, small and pale and still, was a child's hand. The frantic, hopeful search for a missing girl was over. The grim, heartbreaking investigation into her murder had just begun. Ashley Zhao had been there all along, hidden in the walls of her own family's restaurant, just feet away from her parents as they served customers and lied to the police. To understand the darkness that descended on that cold January night, one must travel back, away from the Ohio strip mall, to the lives that Mingming Chun and Liang Zhao had built, and the pressures that had been quietly eroding their foundation for years. Their story, in many ways, was a fractured version of the American dream. Liang Zhao had arrived in the United States from China in the late 1990s, settling in New York City. He worked tirelessly, navigating the labyrinth of immigration and labor until he secured his U.S. citizenship. His family already had a foothold in the restaurant business, having run the Lucky Star restaurant for 11 years in the very same location that would later become Ang's. Liang was ambitious, a man chasing a vision of prosperity. Mingming Chen's journey was more precarious. In August 2008, as a teenager, she embarked on a clandestine odyssey from China to America. She paid a human smuggler a staggering $20,000 to guide her across the border. Her path took her through Mexico, where she was hidden in a vehicle and driven into the United States. She made her way to Ohio, where an uncle lived. A year later, in 2009, she applied for asylum, claiming religious persecution. She told authorities she was a practitioner of Falun Gong, a spiritual practice banned and brutally suppressed by the Chinese government. She recounted a story of being arrested in a raid in April 2008, detained for a month, and physically punished until she signed a statement renouncing her faith. But the immigration judge found her testimony to be inconsistent and not credible. Her asylum request was denied, and she was ordered to be deported. This began a years-long legal battle, a cloud of uncertainty that hung over her as she tried to build a new life. It was during this period of legal limbo that she met Liang Zhao. They married in March 2010. 7 months later, their first daughter, Jojo, was born. The following year, in the summer of 2011, they took the leap and opened their own restaurant, Ang's Asian Cuisine. They were the sole employees, a two-person operation pouring every ounce of their energy into the business. The restaurant was a success. Locals praised the fresh food, the speedy service, and the warm, welcoming atmosphere the couple created. In December 2011, their second daughter, Ashley, was born. The juggling act of running a demanding business 6 days a week while raising 2 young children became overwhelming. The restaurant consumed their lives, leaving little room for anything else. The solution they landed on was a painful one. They sent both Ashley and Jojo to New York to live with their grandparents. It was meant to be a temporary measure, a way to stay afloat until they could get ahead. But the temporary separation stretched into 2 long, formative years. When the girls finally returned to Ohio in October 2015, the family dynamic had been irrevocably altered. Ashley, who had spent most of her life with her grandparents, was now a toddler being raised by near strangers. She was reportedly rebellious and difficult. Potty training became a major point of contention. Even at nearly 5 years old, she was still having accidents, a source of immense frustration for her mother. For Mingming, who was already stretched thin by the relentless demands of the restaurant, parenting this unruly child became an unbearable burden. The pressure mounted from all sides. Financial struggles persisted despite the restaurant's popularity. The marriage began to fray. Mingming would later claim that Liang became abusive, turning his own frustrations on her. The restaurant became the family's entire world. The girls spent their days behind the cash register or in the back room, their childhood unfolding in the shadow of the kitchen's heat and the pressure of the dinner rush. While Mingming saw Ashley as a difficult child, customers remembered a sociable little girl who would greet them with a huge, infectious grin. It was a family under immense, unseen pressure, a pressure cooker with the heat slowly being turned up day by day. The final, fatal explosion was just a matter of time. The autopsy confirmed the investigators' worst fears. Ashley Zhao had died from blunt force trauma to her head and body. Her small frame was covered in injuries, a testament to the violence she had endured. The news sent a shockwave of grief and horror through the community. The makeshift memorial outside the restaurant grew, a silent, heartbreaking tribute to a life cut short. A vigil was held, the flickering candles a fragile defiance against the darkness of the crime. Friends and patrons struggled to reconcile the friendly couple who served them noodles with the monsters who were now accused of murdering their own child. Mingming Chen and Liang Zhao were arrested and charged. Mingming faced charges of murder and felonious assault. Liang was charged with complicity to murder and complicity to commit felonious assault. A judge set their bond at a staggering $5 million each, citing Mingming's undocumented status and the high risk that they would flee if released. Separated and placed in different interrogation rooms, their carefully constructed wall of lies began to crumble. Mingming was informed of Ashley's death. According to investigators, she showed no emotion. No tears, no shock, no visible grief. Her demeanor was unnervingly flat and detached. She complained about her life, about the stress of the restaurant, about her difficult in-laws. "I only have 2 hands," she said, her voice devoid of inflection. "I'm not a 4-hands girl." She portrayed herself as a victim, overwhelmed by circumstance. When the interrogator finally pressed her on what happened to Ashley, her answer was chillingly direct. "How'd she die?" he asked. "I kill her," Mingming replied, her voice a monotone. "You killed her?" "Yeah." "How did you kill her?" "Just kill her," she said, refusing to elaborate. "Just kill her, and then she die." She admitted to hitting her daughter with her hand. When asked what happened to the body, her response was just as cold. "I told my husband to take care of it," she said. "And I don't know how he took care of it." She confessed to the murder, but she placed the responsibility for the cover-up squarely on Liang. In the other interrogation room, Liang Zhao held on to the missing child story for nearly an hour. He had no idea his wife had already confessed. But as investigators picked apart his timeline, pointing out inconsistencies and impossibilities, his resolve began to fracture. The intricate web of lies he had woven became a cage. Finally he broke. The truth, when it came, was even more horrific than the investigators had imagined. The murder hadn't happened at the restaurant. It had happened at their apartment on the morning of Monday, January 9th, before the 911 call, before the search, before the fake tears. "My wife was very angry with Ashley," Liang explained, his voice heavy with resignation, "because she peed on her diaper and she pooped on her diaper." It was the same frustration over potty training he had mentioned before, but this time it had escalated. In a fit of rage, Mingming had grabbed her daughter and slammed her head onto the carpeted floor twice. Liang admitted he had witnessed the entire incident. Afterward, Ashley was still breathing, but she was motionless on the floor, gasping for air. Green fluid began to seep from her mouth. Liang carried her to the bathroom, trying to perform CPR, but it was too late. Her heart had stopped beating. Their daughter was dead, on their apartment floor, killed by her own mother's hand. Panic set in. "We were both afraid," Liang said. "We were both afraid what's going to happen if we called." They feared losing everything: the restaurant, their other daughter, their life in America. So they made a pact. They decided not to call the authorities. Instead, they would stage her disappearance. Their plan was as cold as it was desperate. They strapped Ashley's lifeless body into her car seat and drove her to the restaurant. They laid her down in the back room, intending for her older sister, Jojo, to see her there when she came home from school. They believed they could convince the 6-year-old that Ashley was just sleeping. Jojo's verification that Ashley had been at the restaurant would be the cornerstone of their lie. For the rest of the day, with their dead daughter lying in the back room, Mingming Chun and Liang Zhao went about their business. They cooked, they cleaned, they served customers, a grotesque parody of normalcy. After Jojo had seen Ashley sleeping, Liang moved the body. He stuffed his daughter's small frame into a plastic restaurant bus bin and hid it in the crawl space above the walk-in freezer to prevent the smell of decomposition. Then, they waited for nightfall and made the 911 call. Liang admitted they had no long-term plan. They thought the police would conduct a brief search and leave. Afterward, he considered burning the body, burying it, or throwing it into the ocean. They had never anticipated the scale of the response. The FBI, the BCI, the drones, the hundreds of volunteers. If we knew that there was going to be like 100 people searching for her. "I don't even know," he trailed off, his voice filled with a hollow regret. "I am so sorry." The confessions laid bare the horrifying truth, but the legal process was just beginning. While the community grieved, the wheels of justice turned. A custody hearing determined that Jojo, the silent, innocent witness to her family's destruction, would be placed in the care of Stark County Job and Family Services. She was later allowed to live with relatives in New York, where her murdered sister, Ashley, was finally laid to rest. In the months that followed, the legal strategies of Mingming, and Liang diverged. In a dramatic court appearance in September, Liang Zhao accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to obstructing justice, corpse abuse, tampering with evidence, and endangering children. In exchange for a reduced sentence of 12 years in prison, he agreed to testify against his wife, the mother of his children. Mingming, meanwhile, attempted to change her story. She told a psychologist that Liang was the one who had killed Ashley, and that he had coerced her into taking the blame, promising that if she confessed, he could get out of jail to care for Jojo. It was a last, desperate attempt to shift the blame. But facing the overwhelming evidence against her and the prospect of her husband testifying, she too eventually accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter, endangering children, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. She was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Upon completion of her sentence, she will be deported back to China, the country she had paid so much to escape. The case of Ashley Zhao is a story of immense and layered tragedy. It is the story of a little girl, remembered for her bright smile, who was killed by the person who should have been her fiercest protector. It is the story of a family that crumbled under the weight of cultural dislocation, financial pressure, and profound psychological distress. It is the story of an American dream that curdled into a uniquely American nightmare, playing out in the back rooms of a suburban Chinese restaurant. There was no monster that snatched a child in the night. The monster was inside the house all along, born of desperation, frustration, and a rage that finally, irrevocably, boiled over. The community was left to mourn a child they had come to know, and to wonder how such darkness could have festered unseen in the bright, welcoming light of Ang's Asian cuisine. Story 2. The Pacific Northwest, with its moody gray skies and evergreen-draped landscapes, was Sativa Transu's home. She was a daughter of Washington State, born and raised in the small city of Cheney, a place where community ties run deep. At 26, Sativa was the embodiment of the region's vibrant, youthful energy. A graduate of Eastern Washington University with a degree in exercise science, she had a spirit that friends described as a ray of sunshine. Her laughter was said to be contagious, her kindness a constant, unassuming presence in the lives of those she touched. She was, by all accounts, the kind of person who radiated light, who saw the good in the world and reflected it back. After graduating, she had moved to the Seattle area, to a place called Milton, embracing the opportunities of a bigger city while maintaining the close-knit bonds of her family, with whom she spoke every single day. But for all her brightness, a shadow had fallen over Sativa's life. It had a name, Taylor Allen. At 31, he was 5 years her senior, and they had been together for 3 years. To the outside world, they were a couple. But within the private confines of their relationship, a different, more sinister dynamic was at play. Friends and family had started to see the signs, subtle at first, then more alarmingly overt. Taylor was controlling, possessive, and emotionally abusive. He monitored her phone, isolating her from the very people who were her anchor. The ray of sunshine was being eclipsed. The evidence of his temper was etched into the walls of her apartment in Milton. Her sister, Michaela Bolu, had seen the holes in the drywall, the broken objects scattered around the home, the silent, violent aftermath of his rages. A former employer who had hired both of them for a time recalled an incident that spoke volumes about his character. Tasked with building a desk, Taylor, in a fit of frustration, had destroyed it with a mallet. His temper was described as ridiculous. Stacia Shirley, the former employer, was shocked when she learned Sativa was dating him. "You couldn't find two more absolutely opposite people," she would later say. The contrast was stark. Sativa, the beautiful, gentle soul, and Taylor, the man seething with a destructive anger. Sativa was not blind to the darkness. She knew the relationship was toxic, that the man she was with was chipping away at her spirit. She had confided in her family that she was going to end it. She just had to get through one last trip with him, a Thanksgiving getaway to Cancun, Mexico. The trip itself was not her idea. She had wanted to go home for the holiday, to be with the family that was her bedrock. But Taylor had insisted. He was very controlling, Michaela would later recall. He had pushed for Cancun, and Sativa, perhaps in an attempt to keep the peace, had agreed. She would go on the trip, and when they got back, she would leave him. It was a plan born of quiet desperation, a finish line she was determined to cross. The last time her father, Jason Transu, spoke to her, she was at the airport, about to board the flight to a place that was supposed to be paradise. The conversation was light, the kind of casual chat a father has with his daughter before she goes on vacation. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken tension, a sense of foreboding that would later haunt him. The trip began, as so many abusive episodes do, with a fight. Before the plane had even touched down in Mexico, the facade of a happy couple on vacation had already cracked. Sativa texted her sister, Michaela, from the flight, telling her they had argued. It was a small detail, but a significant one. The poison of their relationship had traveled with them, seeping into the recycled air of the airplane cabin, a prelude to the horror that was to come. Despite the inauspicious start, Sativa tried to make the best of it. Cancun, with its impossibly blue water and brilliant sunshine, was a world away from the gray skies of Washington. She had been to Mexico before and loved it. She posted pictures on social media, images of a young woman enjoying the sun, the surf, the vibrant colors of a tropical paradise. She sent a text to her sister on that first Friday, telling her the weather was lovely. Michaela was just happy her sister was getting to enjoy herself, even for a moment. She was a tourist in a land of beauty, but she was also a prisoner, counting down the days until she could escape. Her friends were her lifeline, a digital tether back to the safety of home. She was in constant contact with them, texting throughout the day, sharing photos, the small details of her trip. But then, on the second night, the texts took a terrifying turn. The argument that had started on the plane had reignited, this time with explosive violence. In a flurry of messages to her friends, Sativa revealed that she and Taylor had fought again. This time, he had hurt her. The injury was so bad she needed stitches. Her father later learned the details of that night's chaos. Taylor, in a drunken rage, had become erratic, threatening to jump off the balcony of their fourth-floor room at the All Ritmo resort. Sativa's father believed this was the moment she had told him she was leaving him for good, the moment that pushed him over the edge. The hotel staff were drawn into the drama. Taylor was found babbling incoherently near the air conditioning units outside their room, clearly intoxicated. Hotel security was called, and they even called the police. But somehow, before the police arrived, Taylor was brought back to the room. The authorities never spoke to either of them. It was a missed opportunity of tragic proportions, a chance to intervene that was lost in the confusion of the night. Sativa was taken to a doctor in the hotel lobby to have her wounds stitched up. The doctor was concerned. Sativa, trapped in the classic cycle of abuse, tried to protect her abuser. She insisted she had fallen, that Taylor hadn't hurt her, that they loved each other. The doctor, sensing the truth, reportedly offered her a separate room for the night, a safe place to get away from him. Sativa refused. The decision is a heartbreaking testament to the complex psychology of domestic violence, the way a victim can feel tied to their abuser even in the face of escalating danger. That night, friends and family in Washington were in a state of alarm. They had received the texts about the stitches. They knew things had taken a dangerous turn. They tried to call her, to text her, but the constant stream of communication had abruptly stopped. The digital lifeline went silent. All they could do was wait and worry and pray that she was safe. The next morning, Saturday, November 27th, 2021, their worst fears were confirmed. Michaela would later recount what she had been told. People heard screams in the middle of the night, and they said nothing. In the morning, my sister, they found her dead, beaten to death. The discovery was made by a hotel maid. She entered the room on the fourth floor and found a scene of unimaginable horror. Sativa Transu, the 26-year-old woman with the contagious laugh and the sunny disposition, was dead. Her mother, Jamie Bolu, would later describe what the authorities told her about the state of her daughter's body. She had been beaten to a bloody pulp. An autopsy would later confirm the brutal cause of death: strangulation. She had defensive wounds, evidence that she had fought for her life against the man who was bigger, stronger, and consumed by a murderous rage. At just 140 pounds, she was no match for the 260-pound man who had promised to love her, but had instead become her executioner. The call came to Sativa's mother, Jamie, at 9 a.m. that Saturday morning. It was the U.S. consulate in Mexico. The voice on the other end of the line was formal, official, and it delivered the news that would shatter her world. The words hung in the air, surreal and devastating. Sativa Transu, dead, hotel room. For Michaela, hearing her mother's scream of anguish was a sound of pure heartbreak, a sound she would never forget. The family was plunged into a vortex of grief, shock, and a desperate, clawing need for answers. The Mexican authorities acted quickly. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly to one person. Taylor Allen, the only one with her in the room, was arrested and charged with femicide, the murder of a woman, a crime recognized under Mexican law. A blurred mugshot released by Cancun law enforcement showed him in what appeared to be a hotel bathrobe, the mundane garment a chilling contrast to the monstrous crime he was accused of committing. Public records would later reveal a prior charge of fourth-degree assault against him from 2012, a hint of the violence that had lurked beneath the surface for years. For Sativa's family, the arrest was just the beginning of a long and agonizing journey. Their daughter had been murdered in a foreign country, and they were now faced with the bewildering and bureaucratic nightmare of seeking justice through an unfamiliar legal system, all while grappling with an unbearable loss. The first, most urgent task was to bring Sativa home. But the logistics of repatriating a body from another country are complex and expensive. Michaela, her heart broken but her spirit determined, started a GoFundMe page to raise the money needed to bring her sister back to Washington and to pay for a second autopsy. "We want justice and we want her home," she wrote, a simple, powerful plea that resonated with a community that was rallying around the grieving family. The response was a testament to the life Sativa had lived. Friends, family, and even strangers, touched by the tragedy, donated to the cause. It took nearly 2 weeks, but on December 10th, Sativa's body was finally flown back to the United States. The family could at last lay her to rest in the place she had called home. On a cold December day, it was not a somber funeral, but a gathering of love and remembrance for a woman who had brought so much light into their lives. Her friend, Whitney Ford, who had met her in college, spoke of her disbelief and her profound sense of loss. "She was perfect," she said. "She was that friend of mine that meant the world. She changed how I saw things in general and literally opened up the world for me." Michaela, standing amidst the outpouring of support, felt a sense of gratitude for the community that had wrapped its arms around her family. "I'm so glad that she lived a full life at least, and she was just so amazing to everyone," she said, her voice thick with emotion. But even as they celebrated her life, the fight for justice was just beginning. The family hired a lawyer in Mexico to navigate the legal system and work with the prosecutor. They were assured that the case would be assigned to one of the strictest judges in the country. But the process was slow, fraught with delays and the challenges of a language barrier. The family had to make frequent, expensive trips from the U.S. to Mexico to attend court hearings, each trip a painful reminder of why they were there. The case of Sativa Transu is a story of intimate terrorism, of a love that curdled into a possessive, deadly obsession. It is a story about the red flags that are so often missed or dismissed, the escalating patterns of abuse that can culminate in the ultimate act of violence. But it is also a story of a family's resilience, their unwavering determination to honor the memory of their daughter by fighting for justice and by speaking out to save others. Michaela has made it her life's mission to educate women about the warning signs of an abusive relationship. She speaks with the authority of someone who has witnessed the worst possible outcome. She urges anyone who feels trapped in a cycle of domestic violence to seek help, to find a way out before it's too late. It is the legacy she is building for her sister, a legacy of hope and survival born from a tragedy that should never have happened. The case against Taylor Allen continues to move through the Mexican court system. For Sativa's family, no sentence will ever be enough to compensate for the life that was stolen from them. But they continue to fight, driven by the memory of a young woman who was a ray of sunshine, a light that was extinguished far too soon, but whose warmth can still be felt in the love of those she left behind. Her story, as tragic as it is, has become a powerful cautionary tale, a desperate plea to a world that too often looks away from the darkness that can hide in plain sight. It is a plea to listen for the screams in the middle of the night, and to do something before it is too late. Story 3. The cold, crisp air of a Canadian winter can be invigorating, a clean slate that promises fresh starts and new beginnings. For Alison Maher, a sun-kissed girl from Gosford, New South Wales, the snow-dusted slopes of the Delta Ski Resort in Kamloops, British Columbia, were the backdrop to a fairy tale. It was 2006, and she was on a working holiday, thousands of miles from the familiar warmth of the Australian coast. Here, amidst the pines and the powder, she met Curtis McConnell. He was a local, grounded and steady, and to Alison, he represented a future she hadn't known she was looking for. Their connection was immediate, a spark of warmth in the frosty air. Their romance blossomed quickly. They married in Australia in January 2007, a celebration of two worlds colliding. That same July, still in her homeland, Alison gave birth to their first son, Connor. He was a beautiful baby, a perfect blend of his parents. The new family soon returned to Canada, settling in Millet, a small town in Alberta, south of Edmonton. They bought a house, a home to fill with laughter and memories. It was a picture of domestic bliss, a life carefully constructed and full of promise. In March 2009, their second son, Jaden, was born. Alison, who had started a job at an oil company in nearby Leduc, would later confess in court that she had not planned for a second child, a small but telling crack in the perfect facade. To their neighbors and friends, the McConnells were the ideal family. Alison was seen as a very good mother, doting and attentive. The walls of their home were lined with photographs capturing happier times, birthdays, holidays, and the simple, everyday moments of a young family in love. Curtis worked at a hardware store, a steady provider, while Alison balanced her new job with the demands of motherhood. From the outside, their life was a Canadian dream, built on the foundations of a chance meeting on a snowy mountain. But by the fall of 2009, the dream was beginning to unravel. The laughter that once filled their home was replaced by the tense silence of unspoken grievances and the sharp words of bitter arguments. The reasons were complex, a slow erosion of the love that had once seemed so effortless. Curtis moved into the basement, a physical manifestation of the emotional chasm that had opened between them. Alison, who had always battled with periods of darkness and depression, found herself spiraling. The unraveling of her marriage felt like the unraveling of her world. In December 2009, Curtis filed for divorce and moved out, seeking refuge at his parents' house. This was the final, decisive blow. What followed was not an amicable separation, but a nasty and acrimonious custody dispute. Alison, feeling isolated and abandoned in a foreign country, made a desperate plea. She wanted to go home to Australia and take her sons with her. Curtis, equally determined, fought to keep his children in Canada. The battle lines were drawn, and their two little boys, Connor and Jaden, were caught in the crossfire. A judge, weighing the arguments, delivered a verdict that would become a tragic catalyst. The children were to remain in Canada. For Alison, this decision was not just a legal ruling. It was a life sentence, trapping her in a world that had become cold and hostile. The last weekend of January 2010 was shrouded in a fog of despair. The legal battle had taken its toll, and Alison's already fragile mental state had fractured completely. She was consumed by a profound depression, turning to alcohol and sleeping pills to numb the pain. The house in Millet, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. In the quiet moments when the boys were asleep, the silence was deafening, filled only by the echoes of what she had lost and what she feared she would never regain. Her computer became a window into her dark thoughts. Her online searches, a chilling chronicle of a mind contemplating its own end. She researched methods of suicide, seeking an escape from a pain that had become unbearable. In the basement, a noose was found hanging over a chair, a stark and silent testament to her desperation. The precise timeline of what happened in that house remains shrouded in the fog of Allison's memory, a memory she would later claim was wiped clean. What is known is that at some point during that weekend, the 31-year-old mother led her two sons, 2.5-year-old Connor and 10-month-old Jaden, to the bathroom. In the very tub where they had likely splashed and played, she drowned them. After the unthinkable act, she left the house. She drove to Edmonton, a city whose lights must have seemed a world away from the darkness she had left behind. She had a meal, a strange and surreal act of normalcy in the midst of a nightmare. Then, she drove to an overpass, climbed the barrier, and jumped. She landed on the road below, her body broken by the fall, but her life, for the moment, was spared. On February 1st, 2010, the phone rang in the McConnell family home. It was a police officer from Edmonton, calling to inform Curtis that his wife had been in a serious accident. The officer knew nothing of the children, only that a woman had been found severely injured after a fall from an overpass. A knot of dread tightened in Curtis's stomach. He rushed to the house in Millet to check on his sons. The house was quiet, too quiet. He called out their names, his voice echoing in the empty rooms. He found the bathroom door locked. Panic rising, he grabbed a knife and forced it open. The scene that greeted him would be seared into his memory forever, a recurring nightmare from which he would never fully awaken. His two beautiful boys were floating lifelessly in the bathtub. On the toilet seat, glinting in the sterile light of the bathroom, lay Allison's wedding ring. Curtis would later come to believe this was a final, vengeful message, a symbol of a love that had soured into something monstrous. To come home to find my kids left to rot by the person I love and trusted more than anyone else has made it so hard to trust anyone again. He would later write in a statement read in court. Allison McConnell survived her suicide attempt, waking up in a hospital bed with multiple broken bones and, she claimed, a complete void in her memory of the preceding days. From the hospital, she was moved to the Alberta Hospital Edmonton, a psychiatric facility where she would spend the next 15 months. While she was under psychiatric care, a funeral was held for Connor and Jaden. Their small caskets were a heartbreaking sight, a testament to two lives cut tragically short. The boys' family on both sides were mentioned, but their mother's name was conspicuously absent. The case went to trial, with Crown Prosecutor Gordon Hatch arguing for a conviction of second-degree murder. The defense, led by lawyer Peter Royal, painted a picture of a woman pushed to the brink by severe depression and a bitter divorce. The trial delved into the darkest corners of Allison's life. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Alberto Choi, testified that her memory loss could be genuine, a psychological armor to protect her from the horrific reality of her actions. However, he also revealed that during therapy, she had a fleeting flash of an image of herself holding a child down in the water, a crack in the facade of her amnesia. Dr. Choi described her as a high suicide risk, a woman tormented by the death of her boys, but at the same time confused regarding her role in that. The court also heard about a deep trauma from Allison's past. She had been impregnated by her own father as a teenager. Justice Michelle Crichton, in her final decision, acknowledged that this undoubtedly had an impact on the person she became. The possibility that Curtis had threatened to reveal this secret, along with intimate details of their own life, may have contributed to the unraveling of Allison's mental health. In April 2012, Justice Crichton delivered her verdict. She found Allison McConnell not guilty of murder, but guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. The judge ruled that there was reasonable doubt about whether Allison had the specific intent to kill her children, given her severe depression, her medicated state, and her claimed memory loss. I am not satisfied that the Crown has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Ms. McConnell had the specific intent to cause the death of her children, Justice Crichton stated in her 19-page decision, calling the drownings an unspeakable tragedy. The sentence that followed sparked a firestorm of controversy. Allison was initially sentenced to 6 years in prison, but with credit for the time she had already spent in the psychiatric hospital, her sentence was reduced to just 15 months. Since she had already served that time, she was eligible for release and scheduled for deportation to Australia. The verdict and sentence were met with outrage. The boy's grandmother, Audrey McConnell, had sobbed in court while reading her victim impact statement, describing how she placed birthday candles on her grandson's graves and sang "Happy Birthday" to them. Curtis McConnell filed a civil suit against Allison for $940,000. Alberta's Minister of Justice, Jonathan Dennis, publicly condemned the sentence as simply too lenient and vowed to fight her deportation. "This is not over," he declared, promising to pursue an appeal to have her brought back to Canada to face a harsher penalty. Despite the government's efforts, they could not block her deportation. On April 10, 2013, Allison McConnell was put on a plane and sent back to Australia. She arrived at Kingsford Smith International Airport a free woman, while prosecutors in Canada were preparing an appeal to have her conviction overturned and retried on the original murder charges. The appeal hearing was set for October 30, 2013. Back in her hometown of Gosford, Allison was under a doctor's care, but not under constant watch. She was a ghost of her former self, haunted by the events that had transpired in Canada. Her lawyer, Peter Royal, said the upcoming appeal weighed heavily on her. "Her mom told me she, McConnell, was concerned," he stated, adding that she was haunted by what had happened. A few weeks before her death, Allison attended the christening of a friend's new baby. The joyous occasion seemed to be a painful reminder of her own lost children. Her mother, Helen Meager, told Royal that the event had made Allison emotional and despondent. "I guess it brought back thoughts of her own children's christenings," her lawyer speculated. In September 2013, just weeks before she was potentially to be ordered back to Canada to face a new trial, Allison disappeared. Her mother reported her missing within a few hours. Her body was found shortly after, under the Brian McGowan Bridge in West Gosford. The identification papers found with her confirmed her identity. Allison McConnell had taken her own life. Her death marked a final, tragic chapter in a story with no winners. Peter Royal, who had defended her in court, called the news very depressing. "There are not many cases that stay with you, but this is one of them," he said. Alberta's Deputy Premier, Thomas Lukaszuk, tweeted that it was a sad end to what already was a tragedy. The town of Millet, where the family had once lived, released a statement hoping that the end of this chapter might eventually bring some peace to all that were affected. But for the family of Connor and Jaden, peace would be a long time coming. The death of Allison McConnell was not an end to their pain, but a grim conclusion to a legal battle they felt had denied them justice. The case of Allison McConnell remains a profoundly disturbing story about mental illness, a broken marriage, and a mother's unthinkable crime. It is a story that began with a fairy tale romance on a snowy mountain and ended in a series of tragedies that left a trail of shattered lives on 2 continents, a heartbreaking reminder of how quickly a dream can curdle into a nightmare. Story 4. The water off Harbor Island is a shade of blue so pure it seems to exist only in dreams. It laps gently against the pale pink sands of its famous beaches, a tranquil rhythm that has long been the soundtrack to the lives of the ultra-wealthy who treat this Bahamian sliver of paradise as their private backyard. Here, time itself seems to slow, measured not in hours and minutes, but in the silent glide of multi-million-dollar superyachts across the horizon. These vessels, gleaming white temples of opulence, drift into the marinas like visiting gods, their very presence a testament to a world far removed from ordinary life. In the early summer of 2025, one such vessel was the M/Y Far From It, a 43-meter Richmond yacht that moved with a stately grace. To the casual observer, she was a floating palace, a marvel of engineering and design that could be chartered for nearly $140,000 a week. Her decks were immaculate, her interiors a hushed sanctuary of bespoke luxury. For the select few who could afford her, she was an escape, a promise of sun-drenched days and carefree nights under a canopy of stars. But a yacht has two worlds. There is the world above deck, a carefully curated illusion of effortless perfection for the guests. And then there is the world below, the hidden engine that keeps the illusion running. It is a world of long hours, cramped quarters, and relentless work, populated by a nomadic tribe of crew members who chase the sun from one exotic port to another. They are the invisible hands that polish the silver, mix the cocktails, and navigate the seas. It is a life of breathtaking vistas and grinding repetition, a gilded cage where the price of paradise is paid in sweat and sacrifice. In this world lived Paige Bell. At 20 years old, she was a newcomer to the industry, but she possessed a spirit that seemed tailor-made for it. Friends and family described her as a golden girl, a true firecracker, whose energy and laughter were infectious. With a bold and fiery personality, she radiated a light and warmth that left an indelible mark on everyone she met. Originally from South Africa, Paige had embraced the yachting life with the same boundless enthusiasm she applied to everything. She had started her career on another vessel, the M/Y Sweet Emotion, where her colleagues quickly became a second family. They remembered her not just as a teammate, but as a sister, someone whose boundless compassion made the long days at sea feel shorter and the quiet moments under the stars feel like home. In the weeks leading up to July 2025, Paige was practically vibrating with excitement. Her 21st birthday was on July 14th, and she had been planning her celebration for weeks, insisting to anyone who would listen that the day would go off with a bang. It was a milestone she was eagerly anticipating, a coming of age to be celebrated in this extraordinary new life she was building. Her mother, back in South Africa, was already planning to mark the occasion. Paige's favorite cake was red velvet, and the plan was simple. Everyone who loved her, no matter where they were in the world, would eat a slice in her honor. It was a small, sweet gesture to connect them all to the girl who was so far from home, yet so close to their hearts. After her time on the Sweet Emotion, Paige had joined the crew of the Far From It. It was another step up in her burgeoning career, another stamp in her passport. But the two worlds of a superyacht are separated by more than just a staircase. The engine room, the heart of the vessel, is a place of heat, noise, and steel, a world away from the sun-bleached teak decks above. It was the domain of the engineer, a place of mechanical precision and solitary focus. On the Far From It, that domain belonged to a 39-year-old Mexican national named Brigido Munoz. Life below deck is intimate by necessity. Crew members share small cabins and tight common spaces, a proximity that can foster deep bonds or quiet resentments. There is little room for personal space, and even less for secrets. In this confined world, a wrong word, an unwelcome glance can fester. It soon became clear to Paige that Munoz's attention towards her was crossing a line. He wouldn't leave her alone, his presence becoming a source of growing unease. In an industry where professionalism is paramount, his behavior was a breach of the unwritten code. But more than that, it was a violation of her sense of safety. Paige was not one to suffer in silence. She was bold, she was fiery, and she had been raised to stand up for herself. She did what she was supposed to do. She reported the sexual harassment to her captain. An official warning was issued to Munoz. He was told to stop, to keep his distance. But he was not fired. The machinery of the yacht, both literal and figurative, kept turning. The charters continued, the guests remained oblivious, and below deck, the shadow of that warning lingered in the narrow corridors. The dynamic had shifted. A complaint had been made, a line had been drawn, but the source of the problem remained, just a few feet away, in the thrumming heart of the ship. The 3rd of July, 2025, dawned with the familiar Bahamian warmth. The Far From It was docked at Harbor Island, a jewel in its own right, known for its exclusivity and the parade of celebrities and superyachts it attracts. For the crew, it was another day of work. Paige was last seen around 10 a.m., sharing a tender moment as she kissed her boyfriend goodbye on the deck. The day unfolded with its usual rhythm of duties and routines. Guests were attended to, meals were prepared, and the yacht gleamed under the afternoon sun. But as the day wore on, a disquiet settled over the crew. Paige was missing. In the close-knit environment of a yacht, a person's absence is quickly noted. A search began, quiet at first, then more frantic. They checked her cabin, the decks, the galley. The search eventually led them down to the world below, to the noise and heat of the engine room. It was there, shortly after 1 p.m., that the dream of a life in paradise was irrevocably shattered. The police were called to the marina, and what they found on board the Far From It would send shockwaves not just across the island, but through the entire global yachting community. Paige Bell was found unresponsive, lying in the engine room. She was pronounced dead at the scene by a local doctor. The official report would later state she had visible injuries, a sterile phrase for a brutal reality. She had been found partially undressed, with slash wounds to her neck and defensive injuries on her arms, suggesting she had fought for her life until the very end. Lying nearby was Brigido Munoz, the engineer. He was covered in blood, with severe, self-inflicted wounds to his arms in what authorities suspected was a failed suicide attempt. The bubble of tranquility that surrounded Harbor Island burst. The pink sands and turquoise waters became the backdrop to a crime scene. As police began their investigation, news of the tragedy spread like wildfire through the tight-knit yachting world. The initial confusion was compounded by misinformation, with some early news reports showing photos of the wrong man. But soon, the facts began to solidify, painting a grim and horrifying picture. Munoz was taken into custody and transported to a nearby clinic for medical treatment for his injuries. For Paige's family in South Africa, the news came as an unimaginable blow. Her sister, Chelsea, wrote of the family's unimaginable journey, their hearts broken by the brutal way Paige's life was taken. Her parents, overcome with grief, began the painful process of traveling to the Bahamas, not just to bring their baby girl home, but to seek justice for the monster that took her life. The response from the yachting community was immediate and overwhelming. The crew of the Sweet Emotion, Paige's former vessel, launched a GoFundMe campaign to help her family with the crushing financial burden of travel and legal costs. Their initial goal of $16,000 was surpassed in less than a week, ultimately raising over $52,000, a testament to the love and respect Paige had garnered in her short career. Paige was more than a teammate, she was family. They wrote, their words a small comfort in the face of such a profound loss. On July 9, 2025, Brigido Munoz appeared in magistrate court in Nassau, the Bahamian capital. He was officially charged with the murder of Paige Bell. During his first court appearance, he was not required to enter a plea. Chief Magistrate Roberto Reckley denied him bail, and he was remanded into custody, with his next hearing scheduled for November 20th, 2025. He would remain behind bars as the legal process slowly began to unfold. July 14th came and went. The day that was meant to be a joyous celebration of Paige's 21st birthday became a day of remembrance. In marinas from Fort Lauderdale to ports across the world, a moment of silence was held. As her mother had requested, people ate red velvet cake in her honor, sharing photos and memories of the beautiful soul she was. The Bell family and the team from Far From It released a joint statement, expressing their eternal gratitude for the outpouring of love. Your tribute, unity, and love honored Paige in a way that she would have absolutely adored, they wrote. There is no doubt she would have been ecstatic to know that her yachting family around the world celebrated with her. The planned bang for her birthday had become a somber, unified chorus of grief and solidarity. Paige's murder did more than just break hearts. It exposed a deep vulnerability at the core of the yachting industry. The fact that she had reported her killer for harassment, only for him to receive a mere warning, became a lightning rod for criticism. The standing orders for a ship should be zero tolerance for sexual harassment, one industry veteran stated bluntly. The tragedy highlighted a long-overlooked issue, the lack of mandatory background checks for crew members. Under the Maritime Labor Convention, MLC, there is no requirement for criminal checks, an oversight that many owners assume is being handled. In the wake of Page's death, a petition on change.org calling for mandatory background checks for all crew gained thousands of signatures. The case became a call to action, a demand for tangible change in an industry that had long operated with a degree of informal oversight. Ami Ira, a longtime yacht broker, launched the voluntary Page Bell Pledge, which would require criminal, credit, and drug checks for crew members, hoping to create a new standard of safety and accountability. The question echoed in marinas and management offices around the world. If a crew member felt unsafe, where could they go, and who could they turn to for real protection? The Far From It was eventually moved from the Bahamas, docking at Safe Harbor Marina in Fort Lauderdale, a major hub for the superyacht industry. The vessel itself became a somber landmark, a physical reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded in its engine room. The legal proceedings against Brigido Munoz will continue, and Paige Bell's family will persist in their search for justice. But her legacy is already being written. It is written in the grief of her family and friends, in the shared slices of red velvet cake, and in the collective soul-searching of an industry forced to confront its own failings. She was a young woman who wanted to be a doctor, a golden girl with a radiant spirit who traveled the world in search of adventure. She found it in the turquoise waters of the Bahamas, but she also found a danger that had been allowed to fester in the shadows below deck. Her life was brutally cut short, but her death has become a catalyst, a tragic but powerful demand for change, ensuring that her name will be remembered not just as a headline, but as a turning point. The story of Paige Bell is a heartbreaking reminder that even in the most beautiful of settings, the darkest aspects of human nature can find a place to hide, and that the fight for safety, respect, and justice is a voyage that never truly ends. Story 5. The man who called himself Malcolm Webster was a chameleon, a creature of smoke and mirrors. To the world, he presented a facade of quiet competence and gentle charm. He was a nurse by trade, a profession that cloaked him in an aura of trustworthiness and care. He had a soft-spoken demeanor, a face that could easily crinkle into a reassuring smile, and a knack for making women feel seen, cherished, and safe. But beneath this carefully constructed veneer, there was a chilling void. Malcolm Webster was a predator, a man hollowed out by greed and a bottomless pit of narcissism. He was a liar, a thief, and a killer, and his most potent weapon was the trust he so expertly cultivated. His story began not in the shadows, but in a life of relative privilege. Born in 1959, he was the son of a high-ranking detective chief superintendent in London's Metropolitan Police, a man who had headed the fraud squad. It was a background that should have instilled a sense of order and morality, but in Malcolm, something was fundamentally askew. As a child, he was known for his penchant for starting fires, earning him the nickname Pyro. He was prone to feigning illness, a manipulative tactic he would hone to a deadly art in his adult life. He left school at 15 with no qualifications, a blank slate upon which he would write a fiction of his own making. His early career was a patchwork of jobs, a bin man, a driver, an office clerk, before he settled on nursing. The profession suited him. It gave him access to the vulnerable and to the tools of life and death. In his teens, he began his long and intimate relationship with deception, telling people he had cancer, a lie he would return to again and again, a macabre dress rehearsal for the grand performances to come. The first whispers of a darker truth emerged in the sun-scorched landscape of Abu Dhabi. At 30, Webster was working in the children's ward of Tawam Hospital. Within 6 months, a shadow fell over his ward. 3 children, all under the age of 6, died suddenly of cardiac failure, an unusual cause of death for such young patients. An internal investigation was launched. Supervisors discovered that Webster had been injecting himself with insulin, and a horrifying suspicion took root, that he had used the same method to murder the children. But in a culture that forbade post-mortems and favored swift burials, there was not enough evidence for a police investigation. His father, the powerful policeman, allegedly used his influence to get his son out of the country, and the incident was quietly buried, a secret kept by the desert sands. Webster had walked away, leaving a trail of unanswered questions and grieving families, his capacity for evil tested and confirmed. He returned to the United Kingdom, a man with a dark past and an insatiable appetite for what he believed he was owed. He drifted from one relationship to another, habitually targeting wealthy women to supplement his income. "Why work hard yourself when someone could be doing it for you?" was his favorite saying, a mantra that guided his parasitic existence. He was a practiced deceiver, a man who could turn on the tears as easily as a tap to avoid difficult questions. In 1993, his path crossed with Claire Morris. She was a 32-year-old woman from Old Meldrum, Aberdeenshire, intelligent, kind, and financially secure. To her, Malcolm Webster was the man she had been waiting for. He was charming, attentive, and seemingly devoted. They married on September 3, 1993, and Claire stepped unknowingly into a web of lies that would ultimately cost her life. The marriage began with a subtle, insidious poisoning. Webster, using his nursing knowledge, began drugging Claire with temazepam, a sedative. The drug made her drowsy, confused, and increasingly dependent on him. She told a friend, another nurse named Sarah Dodek, that she had been in a strange car accident a few months into their marriage. Webster had been driving, and the car had ended up in a ditch. It was a warning sign, a tremor before the earthquake, but its significance would only become clear in the devastating clarity of hindsight. May 27, 1994, was the day Malcolm Webster decided to cash in his investment. The plan was as brutal as it was simple. He drugged Claire into a state of unconsciousness and placed her in the passenger seat of his Daihatsu 4x4. He then drove to a remote spot on the Auchenwive to Tarvis Road in Aberdeenshire. There was no crash, no swerving to avoid a phantom motorcyclist, as he would later claim. He simply pulled the car over, parked it near a tree, and, with his wife helpless inside, set it on fire. As the flames began to lick at the vehicle, a retired police officer happened upon the scene and stopped to help. Webster, the picture of a distraught husband, calmly and repeatedly insisted that there was no one else in the car. He watched as the vehicle was engulfed in a fireball, the evidence of his crime reduced to ash and twisted metal. The immediate aftermath was a masterclass in deception. Webster spent a week in the hospital, claiming he had been injured in the crash. But extensive tests revealed he was perfectly healthy. His pulse and heart rate were normal. At Claire's funeral, he wore a neck brace, a prop in his tragic play. He held the hand of Claire's grieving brother, Peter Morris, his face a mask of sorrow, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I was holding the hand of her murderer," Peter would later recall with a shudder, the memory of that firm, insincere grip a source of enduring torment. Despite Webster's performance, there were those who were not convinced. A fireman at the scene, Derek MacDonald, thought the whole thing was a bit hooky. The car showed no signs of a violent impact. For a car to be stopped or parked and burst into flames does not occur, not unless it's in the movies, he later said. A police officer investigating the case in his own time was troubled by the same inconsistencies. The slow speed of the vehicle, the lack of skid marks, and the simple, horrifying question of why Claire had not been able to escape. But at the time, these doubts were not enough. The official cause of death was ruled an accident, and Malcolm Webster, the grieving widower, collected over €200,000 in life insurance payouts. He used the money to buy a Range Rover, a yacht, and to continue his predatory seduction of a string of unsuspecting women. Shortly after Claire's death, Webster began a relationship with Geraldine Oakley, a computer manager at the hospital where he worked. The relationship was secret, but Oakley grew suspicious. Webster kept asking her if a second autopsy was likely to be performed on Claire. The question was odd, insistent, and it planted a seed of doubt in her mind. Twice, she went to the hospital's consultant pathologist to voice her concerns, but each time, she stopped at the last minute, unable to articulate the terrible suspicion that had taken hold. In 1995, Webster moved to Saudi Arabia, and his web of deceit expanded. He began a telephone relationship with a woman named Brenda Grant. When they finally met, he repeatedly offered her drugs. She refused, a decision she would later realize had likely saved her life. Their relationship overlapped with another, and in 2005, years later, he contacted her out of the blue, telling her he had leukemia and arranging a trip to Paris. He was a man who juggled lives and lies with a chilling, effortless proficiency. In 1997, on the other side of the world, Webster found his next target. Felicity Drum was an oncology nurse from New Zealand. They married, and she gave birth to a son. Once again, the pattern began to repeat itself, but this time, the victim would fight back. The first signs of trouble were subtle. On their honeymoon, after drinking a cup of tea Webster had given her, Felicity slept for 36 hours straight. On another occasion, she slept for 18 hours. She began to experience double vision, and a blood test revealed abnormalities with her liver. He was drugging her, just as he had drugged Claire. Then came the fires. During their marriage, Webster caused 3 separate house fires, including one at Felicity's parents' house. In each case, he was the hero, the one who discovered the blaze and raised the alarm. It was a classic arsonist's signature, a desperate craving for attention and control. His lies escalated. He told Felicity he had had a heart attack. He told her he had cancer. He made endless excuses about his financial situation, claiming his money from Scotland was tied up and had not yet been transferred to their joint account in New Zealand. He had 9 insurance policies on her life, totaling 750,000 euros. The final deadline to make a payment on a house they were buying was February 12, 1999. On that day, they were driving to the bank. Webster was at the wheel. Suddenly, he claimed there was something wrong with the steering. The car swerved violently across 2 lanes of traffic and back again. But when Felicity, in a surge of adrenaline, grabbed the steering wheel, she found it worked perfectly. The car ended up in a ditch, a chilling echo of the accident he had staged with Claire years before. What happened next saved her life. Webster immediately got out of the car and went to the boot. He screamed at her to stay in the car, his voice laced with a terrifying urgency. But Felicity refused. She got out, her mind racing, the pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning to click into place. She called her lawyer to drive her to the bank. Webster, his plan thwarted, resorted to his old tricks. He feigned a heart attack and was taken to the hospital. While he was there, Felicity went to the bank. The truth she uncovered was devastating. He had systematically cleaned out $140,000 from her bank account. The man she had married, the father of her child, was a fraud. When she later confronted him, he admitted his plan to kill her with a chilling, offhand remark. "You would have died happy." The New Zealand police issued 4 warrants for his arrest on charges of arson, administering a drug, and attempting to stupefy his wife. But by then, Malcolm Webster had fled the country, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. He returned to the UK, and by 2002, he was in a relationship with another woman, Christina Willis. The pattern was depressingly familiar. He borrowed money from her without paying it back, told her he had cancer, and persuaded her to make a will in his name, giving him power of attorney. He seemed to be grooming her as his next victim, but for reasons that remain unclear, the relationship ended. It is speculated that he had found a more lucrative target, a wealthy woman named Simone Banerjee. Simone was a successful, independent woman with a passion for sailing. Webster, in his most audacious performance yet, told her he was dying of terminal leukemia. He shaved his head and eyebrows to complete the illusion. Utterly convinced, Simone changed her will, leaving her entire estate to him. They planned to marry, a bigamous union that would give him complete control of her finances. He had a plan for her, too. Simone later discovered that the foil on her life jacket had been punctured. "I have pretty much no doubt that the boat was the way it was going to go," she said, the realization dawning that he had intended to drown her, staging yet another tragic accident. But Webster's carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. The catalyst was a chance meeting. Felicity Drum's sister, in a conversation with a British police officer, mentioned her family's suspicions about her brother-in-law. That conversation sparked an interest, and the wheels of a complex, international investigation began to turn. In 2008, Grampian Police in Scotland launched Operation Field, a full-scale re-examination of the death of Claire Morris. At the same time, the New Zealand police reopened their investigation into the attempted murder of Felicity Drum. Investigators began to painstakingly piece together the puzzle of Malcolm Webster's life, a journey that would take them across continents and through more than a decade of lies. They interviewed over 1,000 people, slowly but surely untangling the web of deceit he had spun. The net finally closed in 2009. Webster was arrested and charged with the murder of Claire Morris, the attempted murder of Felicity Drum, and attempting to bigamously marry Simone Banerjee to gain access to her estate. The police presented Simone with an Osmond warning, a formal notice of a credible threat to her life, revealing that her fiancé was not only a fraud, but also a married man with a son and a dark, violent past. Initially, she dismissed it as nonsense, a testament to the power of his manipulation. But the evidence was overwhelming, and her world collapsed. The trial of Malcolm Webster began on February 1st, 2011, at the High Court in Glasgow. It would become the longest criminal trial with a single accused in Scottish legal history, a marathon of evidence and testimony that laid bare the chilling depths of his depravity. The prosecution, led by Advocate Depute Derek Ogg QC, painted a picture of a most cruel practiced deceiver, a man who, if convicted, would become one of the most notorious murderers of modern times. They presented a mountain of evidence, the product of a vast and painstaking investigation that had utilized advances in forensic toxicology, accountancy, and crash investigation techniques to uncover the truth that had been buried for so long. The defense, led by Edgar Praise QC, was left with an almost impossible task. They admitted that Webster was a liar, a thief, a philanderer, and a ratbag, but they insisted he was not a killer. Webster himself maintained his innocence, sticking to the story that Claire's death was a tragic accident. But the evidence was irrefutable. The jury of 9 women and 6 men listened for 50 days as the prosecution laid out its case. They heard from Felicity Drum, who recounted the drugging, the fires, and the terrifying car crash. They heard from Simone Banerjee, who spoke of his leukemia lie and the punctured life jacket. They heard from a parade of other women who had been duped and defrauded by him. And they heard the cold, hard facts of the forensic evidence, which showed that Claire Morris had been drugged and that the fire that killed her had been deliberately set. On May 19, 2011, after deliberating for less than 4 hours, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Malcolm Webster guilty of murder and attempted murder. He sat still in the dock, showing no emotion as the verdicts were read out, the mask of the charming, gentle nurse finally stripped away to reveal the monster beneath. On July 5, 2011, he was sentenced. Judge Lord Bannatyne described his crimes as cold-blooded, brutal, and callous, committed for financial gain. He sentenced Webster to life in prison, with a minimum term of 30 years. In the aftermath, the full scope of his evil continued to be revealed. Claire's family fought to have the inscription on her headstone changed, to remove his name and the loving words he had chosen for the woman he had murdered. Her brother, Peter, found the original inscription offensive, arguing that the marriage was designed towards murder. After a protracted battle, the council agreed, and Malcolm Webster was banned from ever being buried alongside his first victim. Webster's life in prison has been a pathetic postscript to his reign of terror. He has been attacked by other inmates and reportedly hired a convicted child molester for protection. He has launched a series of failed appeals, his pleas of innocence falling on deaf ears. The man who had lived a life of elaborate fantasy, who had played the role of a loving husband and a dying patient with such chilling conviction, was now just another inmate, described by one as really boring. The case of Malcolm Webster is a chilling study in the nature of psychopathy. It is a story of a man who saw other human beings not as people to be loved and cherished, but as resources to be exploited and, when their usefulness was at an end, to be discarded. It is a story of the quiet, creeping horror that can hide behind a charming smile, and of the incredible strength of the women who survived him and fought to bring him to justice. And it is a story of a family's enduring love for a daughter and sister, a love that would not rest until the truth of her murder was finally brought into the light. Story 6. The end of summer in Cumberland Beach, Ontario, always carried a particular kind of magic. It was a time of golden, slanting light and the last, lingering warmth before the crisp autumn air began to bite at the edges of the day. On the Labor Day weekend of 1990, that magic felt especially potent. The small resort town on the shore of Lake Couchiching was humming with the lazy, contented buzz of vacationers, savoring the final days of their holiday. For 13-year-old Leah Souza, it was a time brimming with promise. High school was just days away, a thrilling new chapter waiting to be written. She was on the cusp of everything, a bright, happy girl with a world of possibilities stretching out before her. But in the deep, silent hours of Saturday, September 1st, something terrible and ancient tore through the fabric of that idyllic summer. It came not with a roar, but with the quiet, deliberate sound of shattering glass. It moved through the small, unassuming house on Beachview Avenue like a phantom, a creature of pure malice, leaving a wake of unimaginable violence. And by the time the sun rose on that Saturday, casting its warm, indifferent light on the dew-kissed lawns of Cumberland Beach, Leah Sousa's world of possibilities had been extinguished forever. The magic of summer had curdled into a nightmare from which her family, and the town itself, would never fully awaken. The day had been ordinary, steeped in the simple rhythms of family life. Leah, her 36-year-old single mother, Laura, and her 9-month-old baby brother, Michael, had recently returned from a trip to visit Laura's sister. The house was filled with the easy chaos of unpacking and settling back in. Leah was a girl full of life and laughter. She was a good student, a loyal friend, and a doting big sister. She had spent the evening with a friend, their conversation likely filled with the excited chatter of teenage girls about to embark on the great adventure of high school. That night, instead of sleeping in her own bed, she had drifted off on the living room couch, the familiar sounds of the house a comforting lullaby. In her bedroom, Laura slept with her infant son nearby, the deep, exhausted sleep of a single mother. The house was quiet, a picture of domestic peace. The first sign of the horror to come was a sound that likely never registered in their sleeping minds, the sharp crack of glass breaking at the back of the house. An intruder had smashed a window pane on the rear door, reached inside, and unlocked it. He stepped into the quiet home, a shadow bringing with him a capacity for violence that defied comprehension. The police would later theorize that he was motivated by a deviant, sadistic sexual hunger, a man for whom the infliction of pain was an end in itself. He moved first toward the master bedroom. Laura Souza, asleep in her bed, was his first victim. He raised a heavy, blunt metal object. Investigators would later speculate it was a pipe, a crowbar, or a tire iron, and brought it down on her head with savage force. He struck her again and again, the sickening thuds a grotesque percussion in the silent house. In his crib nearby, the baby remained untouched, a silent, unknowing witness to his mother's brutalization. Leaving Laura for dead, the attacker then turned his attention to the living room. Leah, asleep on the couch, was now the focus of his depraved rage. He sexually assaulted her, a violation as profound as it was violent. But his sadism was not yet sated. He dragged her, likely semi-conscious, from the couch, down 3 steps, and out into the cool night air of the backyard. There, on the damp grass, he continued his frenzied assault, using the same metal weapon he had used on her mother, beating her until her young life was extinguished. He then vanished back into the darkness from which he came, leaving behind a scene of carnage that would forever scar the soul of the small town. The next morning, the sun rose on a world that was oblivious to the horror that had unfolded on Beachview Avenue. A neighborhood friend of Leah's, a young girl whose name has been shielded from the public record, began her day with the simple, innocent intention of seeing her best friend. She called the Souza house several times, but there was no answer. A prickle of concern, A sense that something was not right prompted her to get on her bicycle and ride over. She knocked on the front door, her calls echoing into the unnerving silence within. Still no answer. Following a path around the side of the house, she walked into the backyard. And there, her childhood innocence was shattered in an instant. Sprawled on the grass, which was trampled and dark with blood, was the lifeless body of her friend, Leah. She had been so savagely beaten that she was almost unrecognizable. The girl's screams brought the horror into the light of day. The Ontario Provincial Police, OPP, were summoned, and what they found inside the house was a scene of almost unimaginable brutality. The home was spattered with blood, a testament to the violent struggle that had taken place. And on the living room floor, clinging to life by the thinnest of threads, they found Laura Souza. She had suffered massive head injuries, her skull and face shattered, but somehow, miraculously, she was still breathing. The phone was found on the ground, smashed and covered in blood, a heartbreaking indication that at some point she had tried to call for help. Laura was rushed to a Toronto hospital, where she would spend the next 3 weeks under police guard, the authorities fearing that her attacker might return to finish the job. She would survive, but the woman who emerged from that hospital was a shadow of her former self. The physical injuries were devastating. Metal plates were required to reconstruct her skull and right cheek, and she was left with permanent vision and hearing damage. But the most cruel injury of all was the one inflicted on her memory. The brutal assault had wiped her mind clean of the events of that night. She had no recollection of the attack, no memory of the man who had murdered her daughter and left her for dead. She was the only witness, and the identity of the killer was locked away in a part of her mind that she could never access. The investigation into Leah Souza's murder became the largest in the history of the OPP. Detectives were faced with a crime of almost unparalleled savagery and a frustrating lack of evidence. The killer had brought the murder weapon with him and taken it when he left. The crime scene was a bloody tableau, but in a tragic twist of forensic fate, the attacker had left none of his own DNA behind. No blood, no hair, no semen. The only significant clue was a single, bloody shoe print left inside the house. Forensic analysis identified it as belonging to a size 9 or 10 Nike leather court or tennis shoe, a common brand and size that did little to narrow the pool of potential suspects. The investigation was a massive undertaking. Over the years, police would conduct more than 1,500 interviews, chasing down thousands of tips. They canvassed the neighborhood, set up billboards along the highway featuring Leah's smiling face and the haunting question, "Do you know who killed Leah Souza?" and offered a $50,000 reward for information. They arrested several individuals over the years, but no one was ever charged. The central, agonizing paradox of the case was Laura. She was the key, the one person who had seen the face of the killer. Investigators tried everything to unlock her memories. She underwent hypnosis. She was administered sodium pentothal, the so-called truth serum. But the trauma had sealed the door to that part of her mind, and it remained stubbornly, heartbreakingly locked. Her frustration was immense, a constant, tormenting knowledge that the answer to her daughter's murder was trapped inside her own head, just beyond her reach. The police theories evolved over time. They initially believed the attacker was known to the family, that Laura was the intended target, and that something had gone amiss, causing the killer's attention to shift to Leah. Laura's brother, Carlos Souza, initially shared this belief, telling the press he thought it was someone Leah knew. But he later revised his opinion, pointing to the evidence of a forced entry as a sign of a stranger attack. A criminal profiler brought in by the OPP painted a chilling portrait of the killer, a dysfunctional, sadistic individual, likely rejected by women, who was driven by deviant sexual needs. The profile suggested a man who was hiding in plain sight, a monster living among them. As the years stretched into decades, a dark shadow began to loom over the investigation. His name was Brian Timothy Elson. Just 4 months after Leah's murder, in January 1991, Elson stabbed and killed another teenage girl, 17-year-old Sandra Bannister. The crime was brutal, and for it, he served a mere 6 years in prison. What made Elson a compelling person of interest in the Souza case was a chilling coincidence. His grandmother lived just down the street from the Souza family in Cumberland Beach. Police came to believe that Elson was in town on the night Leah was murdered. He fit the profiler's description of a sexually motivated, sadistic killer. Over the years, he was interviewed numerous times, and at one point, was even arrested in connection with the Souza case, though he was never charged. In 2010, the investigative news tracked Elson down to the nearby town of Aurelia, where he was living quietly after his release from prison. A reporter confronted him on camera, asking him directly about his involvement in Leah's murder. He denied it, his face a mask of practiced indifference, but the cloud of suspicion that hung over him remained dark and heavy. Was he the man who had slipped into the Souza home that night? Was he the monster who had eluded justice for so long? Without a confession or a definitive piece of forensic evidence, the question remains unanswered, another ghost in a case full of them. The murder of Leah Souza left a deep and permanent scar on her family and the community. The little house on Beachview Avenue, the scene of so much horror, was eventually repossessed and sold at a loss. Laura Souza was forced to rebuild her life from the ashes of a tragedy that had taken her daughter and her memory. She raised her son, Michael, the baby who had slept through the nightmare, but the joy was always tempered by the profound, unending grief of a mother who had lost a child and could not remember why. The case remains open, a thick, dusty file in the OPP offices, a testament to a crime that has refused to yield its secrets. It is a story of a life cut short, of a mother's unending torment, and of a community haunted by the knowledge that a killer walked among them and then, like a phantom, disappeared into the night. The question of who killed Leah Souza still hangs in the air of Cumberland Beach, a cold, unanswered whisper on the wind blowing in off the lake, a tragic legacy of a summer that ended in blood and sorrow. Story 7. The autumn of 2012 swept into Omaha, Nebraska, with a restless energy. For Dave Kropa, it was the season of new beginnings. At 35, he was newly single after a long-term relationship had run its course, and he was navigating the unfamiliar landscape of solitude and independence. An auto shop manager by day, he found his evenings stretching out before him, empty and quiet. Like so many in the modern age, he turned to the digital world to fill the void, creating a profile on an online dating site, a tentative step into a sea of unknown possibilities. He wasn't looking for love, not in the permanent, all-consuming sense. He was clear about that, both with himself and with the women he met. He wanted connection without commitment, a series of pleasant encounters to ease the transition into his new life. It was through this digital portal that he first met Shauna, Liz Gollier. She was a single mother, attractive and engaging, and they quickly fell into an easy rhythm of casual dates. Their relationship was physical, a comfortable arrangement that suited Dave's desire for uncomplicated companionship. He was upfront with her. He was seeing other people, and their connection was not exclusive. Liz, it seemed, understood. A few months later, a different kind of spark ignited, not through a screen, but across the polished floor of his auto shop. Carrie Farver, a 37-year-old single mother, brought her Ford Explorer in for maintenance. She was vibrant and self-assured, a programmer with a bright career and a warm, infectious energy that drew people in. As Dave explained the necessary repairs, their eyes met, and an undeniable chemistry crackled in the air between them. He asked her out. Their first date was a whirlwind of easy laughter and intense connection. Carrie, like Dave, was not looking for a serious relationship. She was focused on her son, Max, and her burgeoning career. When she told him she wanted to keep things casual, Dave felt like he had hit the jackpot. Their arrangement was perfect, a shared understanding of freedom and fun. The threads of these two separate relationships were about to become tangled in a way none of them could have imagined. On one of their early dates, Carrie left Dave's apartment just as Liz Gollier was arriving unannounced to pick up some belongings. The two women passed each other in the hallway, a fleeting, 10-second encounter between strangers, a moment so brief it should have been forgotten. But in that single charged instant, a seed of obsessive jealousy was planted, a seed that would grow into a monstrous, deadly obsession. Carrie's work was demanding, and a big project required her to be close to her downtown office, a considerable distance from her home in Macedonia, Iowa. Dave, whose apartment was just around the corner from her workplace, offered her a place to stay. It was a practical solution, an extension of their casual, convenient arrangement. On the morning of November 13th, 2012, their routine was simple and domestic. Dave kissed her goodbye as he left for work, expecting to see her that evening. It was the last time he, or anyone who knew her, would ever see Carrie Farver alive. Later that morning, Dave's phone buzzed with a text from Carrie's number. The message was jarringly out of character. She wanted them to move in together. Confused, Dave texted back, reminding her of their agreement to keep things casual. The reply was instantaneous and venomous. "Fine. I hate you. I'm dating someone else. I don't want to see you anymore. Go away." The message was laced with profanity, a torrent of rage that left Dave bewildered. When he returned to his apartment that evening, Carrie was gone. All her things had vanished. Initially, he felt a sense of relief, a feeling that he had dodged a bullet, narrowly escaping a relationship that had suddenly become complicated and volatile. He had no way of knowing that he had not escaped anything. He was, in fact, stepping into a meticulously crafted nightmare. For Carrie's mother, Nancy Rainey, the nightmare began with a similar series of strange and unsettling text messages. The messages claimed Carrie had abruptly taken a new job in Kansas and was starting a new life. Nancy was thrown. It was completely unlike her daughter to make such a life-altering decision without a word to her family. She tried to call, but her calls went unanswered. The texts from Carrie became increasingly erratic and cruel, filled with uncharacteristic spelling and grammatical errors that set off alarm bells for Nancy, who knew her daughter to be a stickler for punctuation. When Carrie failed to show up for her half-brother's wedding, Nancy's worry turned to panic. On November 16th, 2012, 3 days after she was last seen, Nancy Rainey reported her daughter missing. The initial police response was dismissive. When Nancy told them about Carrie's bipolar diagnosis, the officers latched onto it as an explanation for her disappearance. They suggested that she had likely stopped taking her medication and was exhibiting erratic behavior, a common occurrence, they assured her. But Nancy knew her daughter. She knew that Carrie was in a good place, that she was devoted to her son, Max, and that she would never willingly abandon her life and family. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. For the authorities, Carrie Farver was not a missing person. She was a woman who had chosen to walk away. While Nancy fought a lonely battle to find her daughter, Dave Kropa's life was slowly being dismantled by a phantom. The initial burst of angry texts from Carrie morphed into a relentless campaign of digital harassment. Over the next 3 years, he would receive more than 15,000 emails and tens of thousands of text messages. They were a toxic blend of obsession and hatred. "I will destroy your life and take your happiness," one message warned. "I hate you so much that I want to drive a knife in your heart," read another. The digital stalker seemed to be everywhere. One evening, as Dave sat relaxing in his recliner, a text arrived. "I see you. You're sitting in your chair with your feet propped up, wearing a blue shirt." Every detail was correct. The phantom was watching him. He changed his phone number repeatedly, but the messages always found him. The harassment wasn't confined to Dave. Liz Gollier, who Dave continued to see on and off, was also a target. She claimed to be receiving a constant barrage of threatening messages from Carrie. The two of them would be sitting on the couch together when both their phones would light up with hateful texts, seemingly in real time. The word whore was spray-painted on the inside of Liz's garage. An email arrived in Dave's inbox with a picture of a woman tied up in the trunk of a car, a threat against Liz's life. The torment was a shared experience, a bond forged in mutual victimhood. Or so it seemed. The phantom's reach extended to anyone close to Dave. His ex-girlfriend, Amy Flora, the mother of his 2 children, also began receiving threats. The digital ghost of Cary Farver was systematically isolating Dave, turning his life into a prison of fear and paranoia. He bought a 9mm pistol for protection, a cold piece of steel that offered little comfort against an enemy he couldn't see. In January 2013, 2 months after Cary's disappearance, Dave spotted her Ford Explorer parked in a nearby lot. He recognized it instantly and called the police. A search of the vehicle yielded little more than a single, unidentified fingerprint on a mint container. The car sat in an impound lot, a silent witness holding a secret that would not be revealed for years. The cruelty of the deception knew no bounds. 5 months after Cary vanished, Nancy Rainey received a call from a man claiming to have seen her daughter at a homeless shelter. He said Cary wanted her mother to pick her up. Hope surged through Nancy, a dizzying, painful wave. She raced to the shelter, investigators meeting her there, only to have her hopes dashed. Cary had never been there. It was just another cruel game, another twist of the knife. The final, devastating act of the Phantom's performance came in August 2013. Liz Golyer's house was set on fire. The blaze was ruled an arson, and inside, firefighters found the bodies of her beloved pets. 2 dogs, a cat, and a snake, all victims of the smoke and flames. Liz naturally blamed Cary. The stalking had escalated to a terrifying new level. Who would be next? For 2.5 years, the digital haunting continued unabated. Cary Farver existed only as a malevolent stream of text, an electronic ghost tormenting the living. Then, in the spring of 2015, the case, now cold and covered in digital dust, landed on the desks of 2 detectives from the Pottawatomie County Sheriff's Office, Ryan Avis and Jim Doty. They volunteered to take it on, intrigued by the bizarre and contradictory details. They devised a simple but brilliant strategy. Avis would work the case as if Cary were alive, and Doty would work it as if she were dead. They started from the beginning. Avis quickly concluded that he could find no proof that Cary was alive. There had been no activity on her bank accounts, no use of her social security number, no credible sightings. She had simply vanished from the physical world. Doty, meanwhile, focused on the one person who had been a constant presence throughout the entire ordeal, Liz Golyer. All of a sudden she's this focus of harassment, Doty noted. To me, there was something with Liz. They turned to Anthony Cava, a digital forensics administrator, to sift through the mountain of electronic data that had been collected from Dave's and Liz's phones back in 2013. Cava began to unravel the intricate web of deception. He discovered that Liz had an app on her phone that allowed her to schedule text messages to be sent at a future time. This was how she could be sitting next to Dave, feigning shock and fear, as they both received messages from Cary. She had also created between 20 and 30 fake email addresses in variations of Cary's name. It was a full-time job of hate and deception, an estimated 40 to 50 hours a week spent impersonating her victim. The most damning discovery came from the data dump of Liz's phone. Cava found a photo of Cary Farver's Ford Explorer. The metadata revealed the photo had been taken a month before Dave had found the car and reported it to the police. Somehow, Liz knew where the car was long before law enforcement did. The fingerprint found on the mint container inside the car was finally identified. It belonged to Liz Golyer. The detectives now had their prime suspect, but they needed more. They needed to coax the truth out of the killer herself. They devised a clever ruse. They told Liz they believed her latest theory, that Amy Flora, Dave's ex, was the real stalker. They asked for her help to get Flora to incriminate herself. Liz, convinced she was manipulating the police, took the bait. She began fabricating emails, supposedly from Amy Flora, confessing to the harassment. The detectives pushed her for more, for details only the killer would know. Desperate to frame Flora and end the investigation, Liz delivered the final, fatal piece of evidence. She forwarded an email from Flora with a chillingly graphic confession. She had stabbed Cary Farver 3 to 4 times, in her own car, and stuffed her body into a garbage bag. This was the break they had been waiting for. The email gave them a crime scene. They went back to Cary's Ford Explorer, which had been sitting in storage for years. This time, they pulled the fabric off the passenger seat. Underneath, they found a large, dark red stain. A DNA test confirmed their worst fears. It was Carrie Farver's blood. On December 22, 2016, for years after Carrie vanished, Liz Gollier was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. She denied everything, but the digital trail she had so carefully constructed to frame her victim had become a map leading directly to her. The case against her was almost entirely circumstantial. There was no body, no murder weapon, and no confession. Gollier's attorney opted for a bench trial, hoping a judge would be more skeptical of the evidence than a jury. But then came the final, irrefutable piece of the puzzle. Dave Kropa remembered a tablet he had put in storage and turned it over to investigators. On it, Kava found a micro SD card that had once been in Liz's phone. He recovered thousands of deleted images. As he scrolled through them, he came to a photo that made his blood run cold. It was a picture of a decomposing human foot. On the foot was a distinctive tattoo, a Chinese symbol for mother. It was the same tattoo Carrie Farver had on her foot. Liz Gollier, in her hubris, had taken a photograph of her victim's body. In 2017, Judge Timothy Burns found Liz Gollier guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Carrie Farver did not voluntarily disappear and drop off the face of the earth, the judge stated. Very sadly, she was murdered. To this day, Liz Gollier maintains her innocence from behind bars, but the digital ghosts she created have told their own irrefutable story. Carrie's body has never been found, but thanks to the tireless work of a few dedicated investigators and the digital breadcrumbs left by a killer, her name was cleared, and her family finally had a measure of justice. The phantom that had haunted them for years was finally exorcised, revealed to be nothing more than a woman consumed by a jealousy so profound it drove her to murder, and then to the extraordinary, diabolical effort of impersonating her victim for years, a final, twisted act of possession. Story 8. In the modest, red brick heart of Hyde, a working-class town nestled in the shadow of Manchester, Dr. Harold Shipman was more than just a family physician. He was an institution. To the aging population of this former cotton-milling town, Dr. Shipman was a figure of quiet authority and profound comfort. In an era when the National Health Service was straining and doctors were often rushed and impersonal, Fred, as he preferred to be called, was a throwback to a gentler time. He was the kind of doctor who still made house calls, who would sit with his elderly patients in their neat, memorabilia-filled living rooms, a cup of tea in hand, and listen not just to their physical ailments, but to the quiet anxieties of their lives. He was a pillar of the community, a man of solid, reassuring presence. With his neatly trimmed beard and his calm, almost avuncular demeanor, he exuded an air of unwavering competence. The patients of his single-handed practice on Market Street adored him. They saw him as a guardian, a benevolent protector who stood between them and the ravages of old age. He was the man they trusted with their most vulnerable moments, with their fears, and ultimately with their lives. They would invite him into their homes, these proud, independent women who had weathered wars and depressions, and they would bare their arms for his blood pressure cuff, their chests for his stethoscope, their souls for his counsel. They believed in him. They believed he was there to ease their pain, to extend their days, to offer a dignified and peaceful end when the time came. But under the guise of this compassionate care, Harold Shipman was engaged in a secret, monstrous act of betrayal. He was not a healer. He was a hunter, and his hunting ground was the very community that had placed its unwavering faith in him. For years, in the quiet solitude of his patients' homes, Dr. Shipman played God, deciding with the cold, dispassionate precision of a technician who would live and who would die. He was not easing their pain. He was ending their lives. Armed with a syringe filled with a lethal dose of diamorphine, the medical-grade heroin he used as his silent weapon, he turned the sacred trust between doctor and patient into an instrument of death. One by one, his unsuspecting patients would slip away, their deaths recorded as nothing more than the natural, inevitable consequence of old age. Harold Shipman, the good doctor, was always there to sign the death certificate, to comfort the grieving family, and to meticulously alter the medical records, burying his crimes under a mountain of falsified data. He was, in secret, the most prolific serial killer in modern British history, a man who moved through the world cloaked in the unimpeachable authority of a doctor's white coat, his true nature hidden in plain sight. The path that led Harold Shipman to the sitting rooms of Hyde began in the post-war austerity of a Nottingham council estate. Born in 1946 to working-class, devoutly Methodist parents, he was a bright and studious boy, but it was his relationship with his mother, Vera, that would cast the longest shadow over his life. He was her favorite, her confidant, and he watched with a helpless, adolescent intensity as she slowly succumbed to lung cancer. In the final, painful stages of her illness, a doctor would visit their home to administer morphine, a powerful opiate that would ease her suffering and grant her moments of peace before her death in 1963, when Harold was just 17. He witnessed firsthand the almost magical power of a doctor to dispense not just medicine, but relief from pain, a power over life and death itself. It was a lesson that seemed to embed itself deep in his psyche. He went on to medical school in Leeds, a driven and ambitious young man. It was there that he met his wife, Primrose, and by the time he graduated in 1970, they had begun to build a family that would eventually include 4 children. His early career, however, was marked by a dark secret. While working as a junior doctor in Pontefract, he developed an addiction to pethidine, another powerful opiate painkiller. He was caught forging prescriptions for his own use, a crime that earned him a small fine and a brief stint in a rehabilitation clinic. The General Medical Council, the body that oversees the medical profession, issued him a warning, but, in a decision that would have catastrophic consequences, allowed him to continue practicing medicine. It was a pattern of professional deference and systemic failure that would repeat itself throughout his murderous career. By 1977, he had moved to the Donnybrook Medical Center in Hyde, a bustling group practice where he quickly established himself as a hard-working and reliable GP. But his colleagues noted his violent mood swings and his arrogance, and the partnership eventually became untenable. In 1993, he struck out on his own, setting up his single-handed practice at 21 Market Street. It was here, with no partners to scrutinize his work and no one to question his decisions, that his killing spree escalated to an industrial scale. He was accountable to no one, a lone practitioner with the power of life and death, and he began to wield that power with terrifying frequency. The deaths were quiet, unremarkable events. An elderly patient, often a woman living alone, would be found to have passed away peacefully in her chair after a visit from the good doctor. Shipman would arrive, pronounce the death, and comfort the family, explaining that it was simply their loved one's time. It was a heart attack, a stroke, old age. The families, grieving and in shock, had no reason to doubt him. He was the doctor. He knew best, and Shipman had a plausible, comforting explanation for everything. He would then sign the death certificate, a crucial act that closed the loop, preventing the automatic involvement of a coroner and the possibility of an autopsy. He had discovered the perfect crime, a murder that looked exactly like a natural death, committed by the one person whose presence at the scene was not just expected, but required. The first tremor of doubt, the first sign that something was deeply wrong in the town of Hyde, did not come from a grieving family or a suspicious police officer. It came from within the medical community itself. In March of 1998, Dr. Linda Reynolds, a fellow GP from a nearby practice, found herself troubled by a disturbing pattern. She had noticed an unusually high number of her former patients, who had transferred to Shipman's practice, were dying. It was more than just a statistical anomaly. It was a cluster of deaths that defied explanation. Her concern was echoed by a local undertaker, who had also noted the high volume of deaths among Shipman's patients, particularly elderly women who seemed to be dying in similar circumstances. Dr. Reynolds, guided by a sense of professional duty, and a growing unease she could no longer ignore, decided to act. She took her concerns to John Pollard, the coroner for the district. She was worried not just about the number of deaths, but about the number of cremation forms Shipman was asking her to countersign. In the UK, the cremation process required a second doctor to certify the death, a safeguard intended to prevent foul play. Shipman, it seemed, was bringing an inordinate number of these forms to his colleagues. Reynolds suspected something was terribly wrong. She feared that a doctor in her own town was a killer. The coroner, alarmed by her report, passed the information to the Greater Manchester Police. An investigation was launched, but it was a quiet, almost tentative affair, handled by inexperienced officers who were perhaps daunted by the prospect of investigating a respected family doctor. They conducted a discreet inquiry, checking records and looking for obvious red flags. They found none. Shipman's records, meticulously falsified, were a fortress of lies. They showed patients with deteriorating health, conditions that would make their sudden deaths seem plausible. The police, unable to find sufficient evidence to bring charges, concluded that there was no case to answer. On April 17, 1998, the investigation was closed. It was a catastrophic failure, a moment when the system had a chance to stop a monster and instead gave him a green light. The decision would be heavily criticized in the subsequent public inquiry, which blamed the police for their lack of rigor and their deference to Shipman's professional status. For Shipman, the closed investigation must have been a powerful validation. He had been scrutinized by the police and had emerged untouched. He was, it seemed, invincible. Emboldened, he went on to kill 3 more people in the months that followed. The whispers of doubt, however, did not entirely fade away. A local taxi driver, John Shaw, also began to harbor his own dark suspicions. He had noticed a chilling trend among his elderly female customers. He would drive them to their appointments with Dr. Shipman, women who seemed to be in perfectly good health, only to learn later that they had died suddenly. He took his concerns to the police in August, his voice another warning cry in a town that was not yet ready to listen. But the final fatal mistake, the act of hubris that would finally bring down the entire house of cards, was yet to come. And it would come not from a concerned doctor or a suspicious taxi driver, but from the killer himself. Kathleen Grundy was not the kind of woman to go gentle into that good night. At 81, she was a force of nature, a former mayoress of Hyde, a wealthy, active, and fiercely independent woman who was, by all accounts, in robust health. She was a pillar of the community, just like her doctor, Harold Shipman, whom she trusted implicitly. On June 24, 1998, Dr. Shipman paid a visit to her home. It was the last time anyone would see her alive. Later that day, she was found dead. Shipman was the one to certify the death, recording the cause on her death certificate as simply old age. For her daughter, Angela Woodruff, a successful solicitor, the news of her mother's sudden death was a devastating shock. But the shock was about to be compounded by a bewildering and deeply suspicious discovery. A few days after her mother's death, Woodruff was contacted by her mother's solicitor, Brian Burgess. He had received a document, a will, purportedly written by Kathleen Grundy just before her death. The contents were stunning. The will left Kathleen Grundy's entire considerable estate, valued at nearly €400,000, to one person, her doctor, Harold Shipman. It explicitly excluded her own daughter and grandchildren, stating bizarrely, "My family are not in need, and I want to reward him for all the care he has given me and the people of Hyde." Angela Woodruff knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. Her mother would never have done this. The will was a crude, clumsily typed document, its signature a shaky, unconvincing forgery. It was an insult to her mother's memory and a brazen, audacious act of theft. Urged on by Burgess, Woodruff refused to let the matter rest. She took the will to the police, her professional and filial instincts screaming that this was not just a case of a forged will, but something far more sinister. This time the police listened. The combination of a sudden death and a suspicious will benefiting the attending doctor was too much to ignore. The investigation that had been so perfunctorily closed just a few months earlier was reopened, this time with a grim and terrifying new focus. The new investigation, led by a more experienced team of detectives, began with a single crucial step. They had to find out how Kathleen Grundy had really died. Her body was exhumed, a somber and macabre procedure that would finally provide the first piece of hard, scientific evidence. The toxicology reports came back, and they were conclusive. Kathleen Grundy's body contained fatal levels of diamorphine, medical-grade heroin. She had not died of old age. She had been murdered. The discovery transformed the investigation. This was no longer just a case of fraud. It was a murder inquiry. And the prime suspect was the man who stood to inherit her fortune. On September 7, 1998, Dr. Harold Shipman, the respected family physician, was arrested on suspicion of murder. The arrest sent a shockwave through the town of Hyde. The community was in disbelief. How could the good doctor, their Fred, be a killer? It was unthinkable, a betrayal of a trust so fundamental it seemed to shake the very foundations of their world. Shipman's wife, Primrose, stood by him, steadfastly proclaiming his innocence. Shipman himself was a picture of indignant denial. When confronted with the evidence of the diamorphine, he concocted a story. He claimed that Kathleen Grundy had been a secret drug addict, and to prove it, he showed the police the notes he had made in his computerized medical records. But the police were now operating with a level of scrutiny that had been absent in the first investigation. A forensic examination of Shipman's computer revealed the truth. The entries about Grundy's supposed addiction had been written after her death. It was a clumsy, desperate attempt to cover his tracks, another act of arrogance that only served to tighten the net around him. The police also found the typewriter used to create the forged will, a brother machine that Shipman owned. The case against him for the murder of Kathleen Grundy was now formidable. But the investigators knew with a dawning, sickening certainty that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The concerns raised by Dr. Reynolds and the undertaker, the sheer number of deaths, all pointed to a pattern. They began to look at other deaths certified by Shipman, and as they did, a horrifying picture began to emerge. They selected 15 specimen cases, all elderly women who had died suddenly and unexpectedly under Shipman's care between 1995 and 1998. One by one, the bodies were exhumed, and one by one, the toxicology reports came back with the same chilling finding: lethal doses of diamorphine. The pattern was undeniable. A home visit from the doctor, a sudden death, a falsified medical record. Shipman was not just a murderer. He was a serial killer, and the scale of his crimes was beginning to look vast and terrifying. The trial of Dr. Harold Shipman began on October 5, 1999, at Preston Crown Court. The public gallery was packed, the press benches overflowing. The case had become a national obsession, a story that tapped into the deepest of primal fears: the betrayal by a trusted caregiver. Shipman, now 53, sat in the dock, a picture of middle-class respectability, denying everything. He was charged with the murders of 15 of his female patients and with the forgery of Kathleen Grundy's will. The prosecution, led by a formidable legal team, laid out their case with meticulous, damning detail. They presented the jury with a mountain of evidence. There was the toxicology, the undeniable scientific proof of diamorphine in the bodies of the 15 women. There was the forged will, a clear motive of greed in the case of Kathleen Grundy. And there was the pattern, the chilling Shipman effect. The statistical spike in deaths that occurred in the afternoons, coinciding with the doctor's house calls, the suddenness of the deaths, and the fact that the doctor was almost always present. The prosecution called a parade of witnesses. There were the family members of the victims who told heartbreaking stories of their mothers and grandmothers, vibrant women who were in good health one day and dead the next. They spoke of their shock, their grief, and their complete, unquestioning faith in the man who was now accused of their murders. Marion Hadfield, a friend of victim Marie West, told a particularly chilling story. She had been in the kitchen while Shipman was in the living room with Marie. She heard their conversation stop, and a moment later, Shipman emerged, flustered, claiming Marie had suddenly suffered a stroke while he had been out in his car. The truth, the inquest later found, was that he had injected her with a lethal dose of heroin, a drug that would have caused her to stop breathing within a minute. Shipman's defense team fought back, attempting to sow doubt in the minds of the jury. They attacked the scientific evidence, they questioned the motives of the witnesses, and they tried, unsuccessfully, to have the Grundy case tried separately, arguing that the clear motive of greed would prejudice the jury in the other 14 cases. But the weight of the evidence was simply too great. And at the heart of it all was Shipman himself, a man who refused to take the stand, who offered no explanation, no remorse, no defense other than a blanket denial. His arrogance, the very trait that had allowed him to kill for so long without fear of consequence, was now his undoing. He seemed to believe he was intellectually superior to everyone in the room, that he could outwit the police, the prosecution, and the jury. After a trial that lasted nearly 4 months, the jury retired to deliberate. For 6 days, they wrestled with the evidence, with the sheer, almost incomprehensible horror of what they had been asked to believe. On January 31st, 2000, they returned. The foreman stood, his face grim, and delivered the verdict. On all 15 counts of murder, guilty. On the 1 count of forgery, guilty. A wave of relief and grief washed over the courtroom. The families of the victims wept, their long, agonizing wait for justice finally over. Shipman, however, remained impassive. He showed no emotion, his face a blank mask. Mr. Justice Forbes, sentencing him, did not mince his words. He sentenced Shipman to 15 concurrent life sentences, with the recommendation that life should mean life. He would never be released. "You have finally been brought to justice," the judge told him, his voice ringing with condemnation, "for your wicked, wicked crimes." Harold Shipman was taken away to begin his life behind bars, leaving a stunned and horrified nation to grapple with the aftermath of his monstrous betrayal. But the story was far from over. The trial had only scratched the surface. The 15 convictions were just a fraction of a much larger, darker truth. The question that now hung heavy in the air was not whether he was guilty, but just how many people this trusted family doctor had sent to their graves. On January 13, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday, he was found hanging in his cell at HM Prison Wakefield. He had used a bedsheet to take his own life, a final, silent act of control. His suicide cheated his victims' families of any chance of a confession, any hope of understanding the man who had destroyed their lives. It was a coward's way out, the final, selfish act of a man who had spent his life preying on the vulnerable. The legacy of Harold Shipman is a complex and painful one. He shattered the sacred trust that underpins the medical profession, leaving a deep and lasting scar on the public consciousness. In Hyde, the town that had once revered him, a garden of tranquility was opened in memory of his victims, a quiet, beautiful space reclaimed from the shadow of his evil. He is remembered not as the good doctor, but as Dr. Death, a man whose name has become synonymous with the ultimate betrayal, a chilling testament to the darkness that can hide behind the most reassuring of smiles.